Welcome to The Long Run. This is a podcast for biotech adventurers. I'm your host, Luke Timmerman. Today's guest is Steve Holtzman. He's the president and CEO of Decibel Therapeutics, a venture-backed startup developing treatments for hearing loss. Holtzman has been around the industry for more than 30 years. He has had leadership roles at Millennium Pharmaceuticals, Infinity Pharmaceuticals, and Biogen. Little known fact, he was a founder and president of a startup called DNX Corp in the mid-1980s. That company attempted to become the first transgenic animal company to make organs for transplant into humans. Since that experience, Holtzman has been steeped in many of the big bioethical debates of the day, as you might imagine. Over the past year, Holtzman has become more outspoken about a wide range of political issues. We're talking women's health, racism, immigration, and funding for basic science. Over the past year, Holtzman has become more outspoken about a wide range of political issues. We're talking women's health, racism, immigration, and basic government funding for science. He has mobilized other biotech CEOs to speak out on these issues that they have historically avoided. I asked him why he's felt compelled to become a biotech political activist. Now, before we get going, I want to thank a number of sponsors for generously donating to the Climb to Fight Cancer. This is the charity fundraiser I'm doing for the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center as part of my climb of Mount Everest in spring 2018. Thanks to Sanofi as the summit sponsor, and to Sophie Nova Ventures, 5AM Ventures, and EBD Group as base camp sponsors. More than $90,000 so far has come in. If you'd like to make a fully tax-deductible donation, just go to fredhutch.org/climb. Now listen up for a special deal. The Biotech Showcase, co-organized by EBD Group, is coming up January 8 to 10 in San Francisco. Listeners of this podcast can get a $200 discount if you type in Long Run, all one word, as the registration code when you register for Biotech Showcase. How's that for a deal? Lastly, the next episode of The Long Run will feature Steve Graham. Graham is the co-chair of the life sciences practice at the law firm Fenwick & West. He has been working with biotech boards dating all the way back to the industry's founding in the early 1980s. Graham also happens to be black. He recently wrote a revealing memoir called Invisible Ink: Navigating Racism in Corporate America. In this book, he details a number of slights, subtle aggressions, unfair dealings, and a few scary racially charged encounters. How did he make it? What advice does he have for young people of color? How can all of us create a more inclusive biotech industry? Keep an eye out for that important and at times uncomfortable conversation about race. Now, join me and Steve Holtzman for The Long Run. Welcome. Steve Holtzman is here with me today for The Long Run. Steve is the CEO of Decibel Therapeutics here in Boston, working on treatments for hearing loss and hearing-related disorders. Thanks for being here, Steve.
Thanks, Luke. It's great to see you.
I want to talk today about politics, political activism in biotech. And you've been quite outspoken on a number of issues this year, along with your partner in crime, so to speak, Jeremy Levin at Ovid Therapeutics.
Right.
We'll get there, but I want to start real briefly with a bit about your background, who you are. You have, I think, been around for more than 30 years in this business and have one of the more eclectic resumes that you'll see. You studied philosophy in college. Can you start there? Like, why philosophy, and how did you get into this business?
Right. I should preface it by saying, in all of my companies, I always meet every new employee, and my parting words to them are, you have nothing to be worried about. Your CEO is trained in neither science nor business, and therefore facts will not get in the way of any sort. So, yes, I started college as a pre-med major, got a few credits short of what was then called a zoology degree, had my first midlife crisis, and ended up in initially intellectual history of Europe, and then went into philosophy and got enamored of the field and did all of my subsequent work and graduate work at Oxford in philosophy, taught philosophy for a couple of years, and then had my next midlife crisis.
But this is not when you're 40. This is 20-something.
In my 20s. And decided I didn't want to be an academic philosopher. Got very interested in entrepreneurship, and this is the early 1980s, and very interested in the new field of recombinant DNA technology and genetic engineering. And without getting into all of the details, basically as an unemployed philosopher, no one would hire me. And so I hired myself. I got involved with some academics, and we formed in 1986 the first transgenic animal company. And that's how I got into the field. Basically taught myself what there was to know, whether it was about patent law or accounting or doing corporate deals. Raised venture capital, took the company public, eventually sold the company to Baxter in 93, 94.
And there are ethical issues involved with the transgenic
everything I've been involved with. Yes, we were making transgenic animals. We were working on transgenic pigs for organs for xenotransplantation. So we're dealing with those ethical issues. I testified in front of Congress in the late 1980s about patents on animals, which the first patents on animals were being granted in 1989. So, yes, I was very much involved in that. And then I moved as one of the early people at Millennium Pharmaceuticals. And so there we were dealing with, from the bioethical front, all the issues of gene patents again, but also the issues of genetic information and its uses and abuses. And I actually set up a bioethics course within Millennium Pharmaceuticals. And because of a combination of my work in the industry, as well as my background, I ended up appointed to President Clinton's National Bioethics Advisory Commission. And I was the only industry person on that commission. And we rapidly had to deal with the first cloned animals, Dolly. What about human cloning? We had the first embryonal stem cells and somatic cell nuclear transfer. We had to deal with that. Uses of genetic information in biological materials, conducting trials in people who were not able to give consent themselves, conducting trials in developing nations, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an interesting 5 years while we built Millennium into quite a rocket ship during the 90s.
Now, all of these issues that you're talking about, I think people would have described in the past as biotech-specific issues. So it's sort of like a subset of niche issues that apply to biotech and what people in this industry do, but to a large degree, we're not part of the big national mainstream debate. Every once in a while, you'd have something like embryonic stem cells,
right?
That would reach presidential level attention. But
Yeah.
for the most part, not really having a big public debate.
Right. I think that's true. Cloning with Dolly captured the public imagination. Genetic engineering in the early days did, because the genetic engineering resonated of eugenics. So that's how you got the creation in the early 1980s of the RAC, and why there's a special approval process for that. But things like the ethical conduct of human trials, it'll hit the New York Times when it finds out that someone has done an unethical trial in Western Africa. Okay. But in terms of some of the issues we're dealing with today, it is more insider baseball. I think that's true.
So you mentioned you went to Millennium, and that was a formative experience for many people in biotech. Then you had a long run there at Infinity Pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I started at Infinity in 2001, and I was there for 10 years. It was a very successful in many respects. At the end of the day, the drugs for the most part didn't work. But I left there in 2010, going to do my first retirement when my friend George Scangos took over at Biogen, and he said, you're too young to retire, so why don't you come help me with this place? And I had an interesting 5 years at Biogen. To the world, I was head of business development and M&A and strategy, but 75% of my job was actually forming a new group called the Program Leadership and Management Group. And that was a group of high-powered executives who ran the cross-functional teams responsible for our late-stage pipeline. And the bottom line is those people led the teams, which in 6 years did 8 worldwide late-stage trials, registrations, and reimbursements. Fascinating experience. You can spend your life in small biotech and see 1 or 2 drugs. To see worldwide development and approval of 8 drugs in 5 to 6 years was an incredible experience.
You learned about a whole different set of issues.
And it changes the whole way I think about drug discovery and development.
How so?
Right from the earliest phases, you need to be thinking about what is not only potentially an approvable endpoint, statistically meaningful, but what is a clinically meaningful endpoint, and what is a reimbursable endpoint. What are the data you need to amass in order to be able to say this can justify this level of reimbursement against standard of care? And so you really need to be thinking about that from the get-go.
You don't want to spend 10 years and $500 million of investors' money and then realize, we don't have the data we need for a payer.
That's exactly right. Now, having said that, you also have to be science-based. You have to follow the science. Too many good drugs, potentially good drugs, got killed by someone doing a market assessment much too early, okay? So I'm not saying throw stuff out. Follow the science, but do great science in the context of drug hunting, where drug equals something which meets a medical need and can be reimbursed.
So it was about, 2015 or so when you got the call to come here to Decibel?
So no, I told George when I went to Biogen, I said, I can't imagine lasting more than 5 years in a big company. So I left there 5 years and 1 month or 2 months there. That was my next retirement. I decided I would do what all old biotechies do, go on boards, advise companies. And my old friends from Millennium, Mark Levin and Kevin Starhead, started back in 2006 or 7, Third Rock Ventures. And they said to me, well, if you're going to work with young companies, come do it from Third Rock. So I was actually employed at Third Rock for 8 weeks. I'm the shortest tenure of anyone who ever worked at Third Rock, because by then I was 5 months into retirement and I was really getting bored. And my dear wife said to me, she said, your avenue of self-expression and creativity is building organizations. Just go do another one. And Third Rock had recently started Decibel.
What were you doing while you were bored in retirement? Just curious.
What was I doing? I was starting to do a lot of writing. I was writing about philosophies of organizational development and mostly that. Mostly thoughts I'd had after 30 years of trying to build innovative organizations. How do you unleash the creative power of people, which I think is the essence of what we do. We don't lead or manage technology and science. We lead and create environments for incredibly talented scientists and technologies to realize their potential and, in so doing, make important new medicines.
Well, maybe that's an advantage in being a non-scientific CEO.
Perhaps.
You know what you don't know.
All right. So in any event,
Decibel.
When Kevin talked to me about what was going on and the premise of Decibel, I think like most of us, I always thought about hearing loss as somehow electromechanical, and that therefore you addressed it through devices. But of course, everything's biology at the end of the day. And I found myself saying that after 30 years of working on diseases that affect patients, wouldn't it be very special to work on something which is not really a disease? It's a human condition, and it doesn't affect patients. It affects people. And that hearing is one of the fundamental senses through which we are in the world. sound, meaningful sound, is at the essence of communication and self-expression. And without hearing, we can't fully experience the joys and benefits of meaningful sound.
Every culture, everywhere you go in the world, appreciates music, derives joy from music.
Every culture in the world that's ever been discovered has some form of music. And so our vision statement says creating a world in which the benefits and joys of hearing are available to all. So that's how I ended up here for one last run.
So you got a full-time job. You got your hands full. You're building an organization backed by Third Rock Ventures. Mm-hmm. And then November 8th of 2016 happens.
Right.
What was your reaction that day? Or the next day?
Well, unlike most, I wasn't shocked. I had been following what was going on very carefully, had become addicted to reading everything there was on the subject. And so I wasn't shocked that Trump won. And
neither was I, and I wrote about this.
And so what happened the next day was just the reality setting in of everything that I was concerned about was now likely to happen. So that was my major reaction.
Sounds weighty.
Yeah.
Like a lot coming down now in terms of immigration.
Right.
What are some other things that were on your mind?
Well, the thing that I felt most concerned about is, and not to sound overly philosophical, but that in the campaign, there were at least two themes. One was about social exclusion of people based on criteria having nothing to do with worth, okay? And the second was anti-scientism. And I view those as two sides of the same coin. That what comes down to us from the Enlightenment is in the form of Bacon and Newton, our idea of science and facts and rational argumentation and rational discourse. And from the other Enlightenment philosophers, the Humes, the Locke's, the Kant's, the Rousseau's, is the notion of the worth of individuals. And so I view the exclusion of an individual from the discourse on grounds other than that they have nothing to say, all right, as the moral equivalent of the exclusion of data that contravenes conventional wisdom. It becomes discourse that's determined by power, political or economic or physical, as opposed to the force of the argument. And what I saw in Trump was expressions of both of those, right? And I was deeply fearful of how that would play out. And as I watched him starting to make his appointments, starting with Mike Pence, all right, whose perspectives on women's health, gay and lesbians who should get quote-unquote conversion therapy, followed by the appointment of Pruitt, all right, at EPA, and a paradigm climate change denier. And then, most frighteningly from my perspective for our industry, Tom Price at HHS. All right, that's really what tipped the balance for me to start to really write and publish back in January.
Now, why Price? Because he was outspoken against the Affordable Care Act?
Both against the Affordable Care Act, but Tom Price believes that women should be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen, all right, and that women are vessels for procreation, and that's about it. All right. And so a turning back of women's healthcare services, a denial of choice, and now pulling that through into healthcare policies.
San Francisco in the second week of January is a tradition for me. One of the beehives of activity is the Biotech Showcase at the Hilton Union Square. About 3,500 entrepreneurs and investors are expected to attend. Listeners of this show are welcome to take a $200 discount off their registration. Just type in Long Run, all one word, as the registration code when you're checking out. Thanks to EBD Group for its support of the Long Run podcast. Now, these are all big public issues everybody engages with in one form or another in an election.
Right.
But you're a biotech CEO.
Right.
What was it that made you say, okay, I need to make this part of my job? Like, I have a responsibility here to speak out, because CEOs generally across America make it their business not to engage for the most part, other than making donations through their company's political action committee or what have you.
Mm-hmm. So there are two strands to that. One is in general about what I believe to be the appropriate role of a CEO in a modern capitalist society, which I can come back to or start with. And then the second is the special role of those of us who are engaged in the business of trying to improve human health. So starting with the latter first, I have a very simple syllogism that goes through my head that runs like this. We exist, the biotech or biopharma industry, we exist to create important new medicines that make a difference, a material difference in the health of people.
You called it a special business.
It's a special business, right? Because the output of our labor is intended to improve the health of people. Well, then we must think health is a good. It's a good thing, all right? So therefore, how can we stand by idly when public policies are being enacted which are inimical to the health of the population? So if you have a piece of legislation which is going to deny healthcare to 20 million people, how can you sit by when the whole raison d'etre of your industry is to improve health? If you're going, and as far as I know, when we develop a medicine, it's for anyone who needs it. It's not for someone who can afford it. It's not for someone who happens to have a Y chromosome. All right. So if someone comes out with policies that are inimical to women's health, how do we stand by and say, well, health for some is okay and not for others?
So you're making a moral argument that these positions are against the mission of the biopharma industry.
Right.
Full stop. Well, and then, I mean, you can also layer in a business argument that if you take 20 million people out of the market who can no longer get access to medicines, well, that's probably not good for the business either.
It's a moral argument at one level, but I want to say it's a deeper level, that it's, put a morality aside, it's in the nature and essence of what we do that these policies are contradictory to everything we stand for. So how can we, without practical contradiction, assert we exist to better the health, right? And then be silent or not supportive of certain kinds of positions. I mean, there's a reason why the docs and the nurses came out against the rescission of ACA, right? They said, we are here to help patients. We are on the front lines. This is harmful to our patients. We cannot stand by, not because it's morally wrong, which it is, but it's not consistent with the whole reason we're here. Well, I view we in the biopharmaceutical industry as only one step removed from the doc.
And so you're saying that the mission here, creating new medicines, I mean, that's it. That's why you get out of bed in the morning. That's the raison d'etre, the reason you exist. Not purely to maximize returns for your investors. That of course is a very important part of it, but not the central mission.
We are distinct from a company whose mission is to make shares and make money, All right. It is true we are capitalist. We need to make a return to shareholders. Right?
Of course.
Okay. But there is something special in what we do. Now, what you've just said goes to a broader set of issues, which is what is the role of the CEO? Do we define the role of the CEO the way Friedman did in his classical statement in the 1950s, that the only social responsibility of a CEO is to maximize profits for shareholders by any means necessary and available so long as they are legal? Full stop. Classic statement, Adam Smith, drawn forward 200 years, okay? I think that's problematic. I don't think that's the only role, for a few reasons. One is, if you wear your purely capitalist hat, then you have an intrinsic interest in the functioning of the capitalist system and its functioning at the highest and best level possible. For that to be true and for that to be accomplished, all right, taking on the assumption that it will be the best for the most, right, you have to maximize the opportunity for all available talent to participate. That may lead you to certain things about immigration. All right.
Half of the industry comes from other countries.
You might lead you to certain positions about the rights of women being able to participate.
Half of the employees in the industry.
Right. If you also recognize that in many areas of our economy, particularly biopharma and high tech, we no longer have the relationship of capital to wage labor of characteristic of the Industrial Revolution. Rather, it's much more of a partnership. These people bring their talents, their energies, and passions to a company to benefit the shareholders. The shareholders have a special responsibility to them as well. It should lead you to different kinds of workplace practices in terms of the acknowledgement of their autonomy. And therefore, since they are human beings, they look to their leadership and say, what do we stand for? Is this an organization I'm proud to be a part of? Right? So you have interests in social positions that are consonant with your workforce, and they see you as standing up for who and what they are.
So you're defining a broader set of responsibilities for the CEO in our system. So you feel that.
Yes.
But then you make the decision to start writing on it. Why?
Well, I guess I first and foremost write for myself. A philosopher named Frank Ramsey, who was one of the inventors of modern logic, once said, if you can't say it, you can't whistle it either. And for me, the sort of lemma of that was, if you can't write it clearly, you haven't thought it clearly.
Well, writing forces you to think it clearly.
Writing is when you find out if you've thought clearly. Right, exactly. And so writing is that exercise for me to see whether I've thought something through clearly. And then I have like if it's industry related, I have about a half a dozen friends out there who I throw these things out to and say, what do you think? Right? And so the first piece in the series that I've done that was published last January in BioCentury, I think was called Leadership and Responsibility, where a lot of this stuff is initially articulated. I just had a whole bunch of people come to me and say, you really ought to publish this. You really ought to publish it. So I did. That's how that came to pass.
Now, one might say, what about existing organizations or channels like Bio, for instance? Yeah. Isn't this part of their job?
So my thinking about that has evolved. So if you asked me that question last January, I would have been pounding the table saying, we're a bio and we're a pharma. And in fact, in that piece I wrote last January, a part of it was called The Parable of Medicaid Part D, okay, or Medicare Part D. And it was a reflection on the fact that if you go back before there was a Part D, we were faced with the fact that people with my late mother was having to make decisions about whether to buy her Lipitor or not, or because she couldn't afford it, plus the absurdity of when she then had her heart attack, she had quadruple bypass, which the government did pay for. But putting that aside, it was obvious from a moral perspective, there should be a Part D to pay for prescription drugs.
Pharmaceuticals are increasingly becoming an important part of medicine that they should be covered like those other things.
Bio, and I remember having discussions at the time when it was coming along with Carl Feldbaum, then the head, and we came out strongly. We support Medicare Part D. We think there have to be certain protections built into it for the industry. Pharma initially came out against it, concerned about the potential monopoly power of the government. And so I think that was an example.
Even though this was a giant expansion of the market and perceived by some as a giant giveaway.
But even putting that aside, to stand up in the face of something that says elders should have to choose between food and drugs is wrong in modern American society.
I agree.
So that's an example of how these organizations, how they get twisted in a knot. Okay?
So you looked at this and thought, dysfunction.
Right. But then, so when January of this year comes along, where is Bio? Why isn't it standing up, right? And
pretty
why
quiet.
is it? And part of what spurred that article that I wrote was Bio made the unfortunate, in my view, and I think probably Jim Greenwood would now agree with this statement, that we applaud the the appointment of Tom Price.
Jim Greenwood is the president of Bio, by
and
the
I
way.
said to Jim, do we acknowledge? Do we congratulate him? That's different than applauding, right? Because it's not clear to me that all of us want to applaud. In any event, I've now come to the belief and view that the industry organizations can only do so much. They are member organizations. Not all of their members have the same views. They do have a role and responsibility with respect to the economic interests of their country and of their companies, rather, constituents, and that they have to decide where to spend their chits, right? And there are a bunch of economic issues, repatriation, lower taxes, FDA regulation, et cetera, which are the proper concern of the industry organizations, and they just made the pragmatic decision that we're going to stay out of these other fights. And I've come to the conclusion that that's just the way the world is. And so if anything, it provided more of a spur, as far as I was concerned, for those of us who, in virtue of how we've spent our lives, are representatives of the industry, particularly leaders, that we had to speak as leaders.
So there was an opening here. Somebody could come through here. In this case, it's you and Jeremy Levin taking some leadership.
So, yeah, an opening or a void.
Yeah.
Yes, both, I suppose. It was more that, the if not now, if not us, who, if not now, when, right? So,
right.
And the immigration ban was the first thing where, again, it was if not us, who, if not now, when.
This was the ban on people traveling from majority Muslim countries.
A select group of majority Muslim countries, not all.
Right. And then you wrote again about the March for Science.
I was asked to participate in the March for Science. And, an interesting point there. The company, Decibel, made the decision not to support the march because the march had become highly politicized, and it was hard to separate support for the march with support or against or with anti-Trump. And there may be people here who are Trump supporters.
Well, I want to get to that.
Okay, so we decided as a company, not my decision, right, that the company would not provide financial sponsorship, all right? On the other hand, that people were free to organize, and in fact, a contingent did organize, okay, and go, and that I was certainly free as an individual to speak, but for example, my remarks would not be posted on the Decibel website. They might go on my blog. They might be picked up by Timmerman. Okay.
In fact, I did publish that one.
Okay, right. But I wouldn't use the organs of Decibel's official organs for something like that. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, to your point, it's a fine line to walk.
Now, I want to come to this point of the Trump supporters, or to put it even more charitably, people who are upset with the establishment. Let's call this. There's an anti-establishment group of people out there, and on occasion they have some points when they point to dysfunction and elites, the dirty word.
Right.
So. And the Trump phenomenon has also, in some ways, it's had a positive for the industry with the appointment of Scott Gottlieb as FDA commissioner, doing some things that many in the industry like seeing done. With whether ever people in the White House know what's all being done there, I don't know.
Right.
But do you think about how do you balance your activism?
Well, I think there's different aspects to that. One is, I think it is important to separate, as I've suggested, when Stephen Holtzman, who happens to be a CEO of a company, is speaking out, versus when Decibel Therapeutics is taking a position on something. All right. So I think that it may seem a distinction without a difference. I think it's a very important difference.
But you are the CEO. You set the culture, the tone from the top. People look to you for cues on what's okay and not.
Right. So I think saying, I believe in this stuff and I will speak to it, and at the same time saying, and I will not use Decibel organs for publicizing my view, says something to my people about that they should feel free to express their views as well, and the company is not shoving my views down their throat. And the very fact that I said, this is not my decision, it's delegated to a group of people in the company to decide how social media should be used, the company's social media, I think is sending a further message, okay, to the company about it's not about the kind of tone I'm setting. It's a tone really about a certain respect for people's personal views. The other thing you said is absolutely true. Particularly since the crash of 2008, I think that a lot of us lost sight of the fact that while our 401ks may have become 201ks, they came back to at least 3.5 right? There's a lot of people for whom it's been a 10-year depression, who have been alienated, who feel underrepresented and whatnot. And I think that was certainly expressed in the election of Trump in many parts of the country. I think we can distinguish that from some of the extreme elements as well that have come to the fore in the Trump in the Trump era, if you will. All right, and that,
you mean like what we saw in Charlottesville?
Like we saw in Charlottesville, yeah, and also I worry about the sheep and wolves, the wolves in sheep's clothes. All right. I would submit to you that a respectable, white, grandfatherly-looking man in a suit and a tie who speaks respectfully about conversion therapies for transgender individuals or gay people is a deeply frightening and problematic person, regardless if they're of the fact that they wouldn't be out there holding a torch.
So, I mean, you spoke, you wrote again, you felt compelled after Charlottesville. We had a moment there when Ken Frazier decided to resign from the President's Council.
Yeah, it's interesting that piece that I wrote then, that Jeremy joined me in, and that one was called "At What Cost? What Cost a Seat at the Table?" People reading it thought I was reacting to Charlottesville, like we can no longer have that we should no longer stay at this table. The cost is too high. And actually, the point of that piece was, why did it take Charlottesville for we in the industry not to recognize that we were becoming complicit?
Well, as you said,
our silence.
There had been many positions taken that were antithetical to the industry mission,
which is what I've been talking about for the last several minutes, right?
And so, yes, why are you still there at the table? What is being accomplished?
That's right. Or how can you? We should have.
Yeah.
And again, just if you think about, so to speak, the overall semantic content of the moment, all right, a failure to condemn blatant racism and Nazism, and it takes a black man to be the one who says no. That's deeply problematic that it gets to that, for us to take a step back and say, whoa, wait a second. So, that was...
the boundaries have been pushed way out, beyond where many people imagine they could ever go.
Right.
So this last round, just after Labor Day, you wrote about, you circulated the DACA petition that had originally gone around the high-tech community, pressing upon the administration to not rescind this executive order from the Obama era to allow the so-called dreamers, 800,000 young people who were brought to this country before they were adults. It wasn't their decision to break any law. They're now in some kind of legal limbo unless Congress acts, which many people don't think they will. This is the high-tech industry mobilized quickly and effectively. You looked around and said, "What? Again, a void, an opening."
Yeah, nothing was happening. Right. I think the high-tech industry got out in front of it and encouraged him not to rescind DACA before he actually gave the talk, saying that his position was rescission with a 6-month delay in implementation. But once he actually did it, all right, Jeremy and I got on the phone together and say, we can't let this stand. And so we needed to do something to mobilize quickly. The high-tech's letter was there on a website, and as I said to you at the time, no pride of authorship. I'm just going to steal the basic content of this and get it out to CEOs and leaders in the industry.
It aligned well with your views.
Right. Well, it's an interesting thing. If you look at that letter, its argument is purely economic.
Yep.
It is purely economic. There's no moral claims. There's no things about the rights of America being built on immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. It just says, here's the facts about the role that these people play.
It will hurt our economy. Don't do it.
And it was easy to say, and with respect to the biotech economy, it will have a very significant impact and doesn't resonate at all with, if you look at the fact of the role that immigrants have played in our industry, or children of immigrants. And so within 24 hours, we had the end number of 184 signatures and shipped it off to leaders of Congress and the president.
So you got he hasn't taken your calls yet.
Yeah.
So you got a lot of support. I mean, 180 people to sign on in that short amount of time. It's pretty impressive. I mean, you must have amassed a pretty good email list or Rolodex over the years. A reasonably good percentage are responding, cheering you on. What
I wouldn't
about?
say they're cheering me on. They're joining, raising their voices.
Okay, well, what about pushback? Have you gotten anybody, like people? What kind of responses have you gotten from the other side?
Well, there are clearly in certain of these efforts, right? There have been CEOs and leaders to whom the letters have been sent who have not signed on, right? So let's call that tacit disapproval, or a decision that they want to save their powder for something else, or a belief that I agree, but it's not going to be effective, so what's the point? Or maybe I got so much stuff in my email, or with many people in my life, they've adjusted their spam filter that it says Holtzman, it goes straight there. That's probably happens in a lot of cases.
In other words, a lot of crickets.
Yeah. All right. There's going to, of a mailing list of 350 people or 400 with about 60 outdated emails, if you're really looking at 300 getting 184, it's not that many crickets, actually. I've had discussions with some who feel that it's not the role of CEOs to do that, because they speak, it's the role of the industry associations, and if the associations won't do it, we shouldn't be seen as potentially undercutting them. I don't see us as undercutting this. I've said this to Jim Greenwood, is I view what we've been doing as individuals and groups of CEOs as complementary to, not in conflict with what they're doing. But some feel it's not appropriate. Some feel that that we need to keep our chips for the other fights.
Tax
and we
reform,
don't want to spend. We don't want to
repatriation.
spend. Yeah, we don't want to. We don't want to spend our political capital here, and you will be identified as such. And then I get some very wacko comments in some of my blogs, which are kind of interesting,
Oh, just from spammers or trolls?
Right. Yeah, no, it's just the people who think that I must be a flaming gay liberal from the East Coast.
Yeah.
So,
anything that you've taken to heart? Any thoughtful critique from someone you respect who has said, Steve, maybe you can run, this will run its course for a while, but got to focus on your company or something like that.
Well, okay. So what I said earlier about the evolution of my thinking about the role of bio has come from talking with people in the industry and saying, you may be frustrated. You might have an ideal world in which everyone would raise their voice, including your industry organizations, but maybe that's not the right way to think about them. So I think that was spurred me to evolve in my thinking. Okay. You ought to just focus on running my company. There's 24 hours in the day. I don't sleep a lot. I put a lot of hours into running my company, and, if I want to do in my spare time this stuff, that doesn't get in the way of running my company. It's only whether these, what I'll never know is whether there is someone who would be a potential corporate partner run by someone who says, I'll never do a deal with a Holtzman company because of that. I can't know that fact. Is it a theoretical possibility? Yes.
Mm-hmm. They're not going to tell you.
Yeah, they're not going to tell me.
We're not going to do a deal with you because we don't like your politics.
Right. That's right. So my board hasn't fired me yet, so I'm okay.
How long do you think you'll keep doing this? Do you want to keep doing this indefinitely?
Running Decibel or being a political activist?
Both. Maybe there's another career here post-retirement.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think the political activism, I wish the need would end tomorrow. I fear that that's not the case. So I think we just have to keep our antenna up. I think there's a lot going on below the surface in terms of rescission of regulations, about substitute regulations without adequate public comment, about non-enforcement of regulations, which I think are very deeply problematic.
What are some examples?
Well, certainly in the environmental perspective, and it's not that I'm a green person particularly, but if we care about health, then I think we care about clean air and clean water. Last time I checked, that's kind of important for healthy kids, right? The loosening up of many of the Obama, or not even Obama, going back to Nixon EPA regulations on clean water and air and whatnot, the free release now of methane gas, et cetera, I worry about the anti-scientism by the fact that so much information has been pulled down off of government websites. You've got people running around making sure that these important scientific studies that have been done are archived somewhere so that they're available. I think that's problematic. That's deeply, deeply challenging. I think that things going on with the government support where you'll have state actions and they'll come to the Supreme Court, and you'll have now amicus briefs being filed by the Justice Department on behalf of state positions that erode particularly women's health. All right. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to go on.
It sounds like you think of this as almost like an existential threat. I mean, if we enter a world that is really untethered by facts and governed by superstitions and fantasies about, vaccines causing autism and this sort of thing, that this could be the thing to kill the golden goose. I mean, the great industry.
Well, yes, the industry, more at stake than just the industry. I think that standards of rational argumentation and respect for the individual are the predicates of a free society. And the free society is the predicate of a market capitalist system, right? And the latter probably is responsible for, or in part necessary for, innovation in the area of health. I think it's all wound together, Luke. I don't think you can pull these strands apart. So is that an existential crisis?
Well, or, maybe more simply, I mean, we can't take it for granted. I mean, why do we have all this amazing research and development and a pharmaceutical and biotech industry in this country? I mean, it goes back decades to, people like Lyndon Johnson and fellow senators at post-World War II who said, we want this to be our national strength. Right. And we're reaping some of those dividends now.
Right. That's exactly right. So, and it's not just, and again, it's not just support for the NIH, it's support for free rational discourse, right? Of letting the facts be the determine the outcome as opposed to the power of the interlocutor. Right. So I think those are very basic concepts in Western society. So as for how long I'll stay at Decibel, I'm 63 now. I don't know, 5 years, we'll see how it's going. And, when a CEO moves on or not is really a function of what's going on at the time.
Well, but coming back to what you said earlier, I mean, you listed off a lot of issues, and I sort of, put them in a little category here that they were biotech-specific issues, things like cloning and such. But these, what we're talking about now, are much more far-reaching and affect everybody. And so maybe, back in the day, biotech executives could have looked and said, well, we have a committee for that's looking into Dolly and, Holtzman's on it. And that, I don't need to worry about that. Right. I can focus just on my science and my company. And that's hard enough. But is this something that's kind of inescapable now that everybody needs to be, everybody in a position like you, board of directors included, needs to be paying attention? Because it really does threaten the fundamentals of the industry.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say that because I remember when I joined Millennium and we were faced with these issues thinking about the ethical issues that would arrive with the availability of large-scale genetic and genomic data, I went to Carl Feldbaum, who was then head of Bio, and along with Elliot Hillback, who was a senior executive at Genzyme, we formed and then co-chaired the Bioethics Committee, precisely so Bio would have an organ to be able to respond to and think through issues, which, I don't think this can be delegated to a committee. I think this is much more wide-ranging and much more important. Obviously, companies and CEOs will decide how much energy they're going to put into these issues. But I would argue that if you just leave it to the big companies that have the apparatus and the Washington offices and whatnot, they're going to have a particular view, all right? And without stereotyping and with the issues of potentially overgeneralizing, they will tend to be run by managers who have more of a focus on maximization of profit for their shareholders than some of us more entrepreneurial renegades, all right, who have bigger ideas about what our role is in the world, okay? As I said, it's not to generalize, fear of generalizing. And so, there are many, many biotech CEOs who would have refused to sit on those Trump boards, all right, and certainly would have been off them earlier when certain actions were taken if they had joined in the belief that they can have an impact on the discourse, right? So I think more of the entrepreneurial types have to raise their voices. And I think even before you're profitable, all right, I think you need to think about your workforce and what they are looking for in the kind of place to which they want to bring their talents. Because again, it's not a relationship of capital to wage labor, all right? They are fully partners with financial investors. They are deciding to invest their talents on behalf of those investors, just as those investors are investing their money in those people.
Well, they work long and hard at these companies, and when things get tough, they stick around. And even when, it might be easier to go pick up a comparable paycheck, working at a consulting firm.
That's right. And, people talk a lot about great cultures in companies. You find out if you have a great culture when the shit hits the fan, and whether or not people stick and pull together or whether or not they pull apart.
So you're building a powerful culture here, too.
I think that the single most important job of the CEO is to create an environment in which great, passionate people can come, do their best work, and do it in a context in which together they can create something which alone they couldn't. You give them that, you give them the opportunity for experiencing joy and meaning. All right. Then they will stay because they own the place. They truly own it, and they have a sense of identity in the place.
That's a great place to wrap up. Okay. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Pleasure, Luke. Take care.
Thanks for listening to The Long Run, a production of Timmerman Report. Pedro Rosado of Headstepper Media was the producer and editor. Music comes from D.A. Wallach. Thanks to EBD Group for sponsoring the Long Run podcast and the Climb to Fight Cancer. Thanks also to Sanofi as the summit sponsor of the climb, and to Sofinova Ventures and 5AM Ventures as the base camp sponsors of the Climb to Fight Cancer at Fred Hutch. Next on The Long Run, listen to my conversation with Steve Graham. Graham is the co-chair of the life sciences practice at the law firm Fenwick & West. He is one of the most experienced corporate and securities lawyers in the biotech industry. Graham also happens to be Black. Graham recently wrote a revealing memoir called Invisible Ink: Navigating Racism in Corporate America. How did he make it to the pinnacle of American business while enduring a long series of slights, aggressions, and sometimes scary racial hostility? Don't miss this upcoming episode of the long run.